Just before we start, can you maximize that window? Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Maurice. All right. Good evening, folks. Welcome to the special meeting of Kimberley City Council for March 21st. The first full day of spring. The sun shone, and Kyle is in search of the dream. We'd like to help you out any way we can. A reminder to staff that are on dialing in on WebEx, if when you are speaking, please make sure and turn your video on. Any further instructions, Maurice? We set the rock. Are you at a campground somewhere, Troy?
At the hockey game.
Oh. I thought we fixed bandwidth at the arena. Okay, thanks for the heads up on that. Okay, without further ado, I would like to call this meeting to order here on the homelands of the Ktunaxa peoples and ask Maurice if we have any late items.
There's no late item, Mr. Mayor.
All right, hearing none, could I have a mover to adopt the agenda? Councillor McBain moves and Councillor Kiddo seconds. All those in favor? That motion is carried. And we have basically one item at this special meeting tonight, and that is the final operating and capital budget changes for the 2022 to 2026 5-year financial plan. We have been deliberating for what seems like, well, it has been many months, and we're getting down to the short strokes. I know council has read through the package. It's pretty thick and it's pretty detailed. Thanks, Jim, for kind of getting all of this information in a way that we can easily understand and know what our decisions need to be here tonight. If it's okay with you, Maurice, the resolutions that we have here tonight, of which we have about 5 or 6, I noticed in the presentation, Jim, you have included the resolution for the section as we finish, so we'll just deal with those as we roll through the presentation.
That sounds good, Mr. Mayor. The first one, receiving for information, if we could get that out of the way, that'd be great. And then the rest are in there, yeah.
Okay, so the receipt of the report. Councillor Talal moves, Councillor McBain seconds. All those in favor? That motion is carried. All right, over to you, Jim. So before I do that, Scott, thanks for attending tonight. I think for those of you who've seen, Scott's on a few days vacation. He's dialing into us tonight from Kelowna. Hope everything is going well with the mini holiday, Scott, and thanks for tuning in. Take it away, Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thanks. It was good to hear that you thought the package was easy to read, easy to follow. Apologize for the weight of it. There is a lot of information in here, but it's time that we get through this stuff and move on to preparation of the bylaws. So starting with the meeting agenda, once we get the presentation up here, I'll flip through the slides. But what's on the agenda tonight is just there's a bunch of slides recapping where we've been, how we got to this point, discussion about financial plan foundation, proposed changes to the operating base budget, discussion about the Aquatic Center parcel tax, proposed sewer operating budget changes, and then a discussion on the capital and non-capital budget amounts. And as council is aware, the last number of pages of the presentation is in Appendix One is a complete listing of all the capital and non-capital projects that we plan to complete over the next 5 years. We're not going to go through those in detail, but if there are any of those, once we get to that point in the presentation or as we're moving through, if council has questions about those, please feel free to ask. Doesn't look like it's letting me scroll, Maurice, unless. Did you do that or did I do it? Okay. So the next slide is budget recap, and I'm not going to go through this. It's really just provided for ease of reference for council, just showing the resolutions related to budget that have been passed to this point. So unless there are any questions on that, we're going to skip right to page 13 in the next section. And the first slide in that section is the bright blue one, the neon colors deliberate. This is a fairly relevant slide that was brought forward from the April 19th, 2021 budget presentation. And really what it indicates is that just given the fact that the operating budget reductions in 2021 related to COVID-19 and the late hiring of some new employees last year, just a bit of foreshadowing that in 2022 to expect an increase that's well in excess of MPI just to be able to pay for getting back to normal and the balance of the salaries for those employees. So the next page is a discussion of the financial plan foundation. And it's just saying that the council adopts a 5-year financial plan every year. Year 2, that plan forms the foundation for the new 5-year financial plan. And we're operating under year 2, the authority year 2 until the new 5-year financial plan bylaw is adopted. So year 2 of the 2021 to 2025 financial plan, we were anticipating an increase of 3.99%. And you can see the breakdown on that. 1.9 was the MPI. The inflationary factor, there was 155,000, just about a 1.42% increase to fund the new positions in operations and planning. There was 3 there. And then there was 0.67% to move the arenas back to full operating from their reduced operating capacity under COVID. So the next slide, it's just a note saying that the base budget is modified on an annual basis for a variety of reasons that I've listed there. So the first section we're going to talk about with regards to modifications of the budget is to the operating budget.
Jim?
Mr. Mayor?
Can we ask questions as we go?
Yeah,
You cool
please.
with that?
Yeah.
So just on the financial plan foundation, the 73,000 to move the arena budgets back to full operation, is there an offsetting revenue associated with that?
There is. This is the expenditure component, so that this is the
Right.
net component. There were
Right.
some actual wage savings as a result of the extended closures of those facilities.
Okay, cool. This is the net number,
Yeah.
the 73K. Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, and please, if there's anywhere you'd like me to stop, just speak up. So the first page of the proposed general operating base budget adjustments, a couple pages up there. Council's seen most of this stuff. At the December 6th budget meeting, we went through all of the changes that are indicated as a recap of adjustments presented on December 6th. On December 6th, staff did not ask council for any decisions on the operating budget at that point in time because we had a couple of big unknowns out there. Those being the RCMP contract, the renewal of that, and the non-market change. At that time, we just had numbers from the preview roll. So we now have the completed assessment roll. So those numbers have changed, as you've probably seen in the agreement here. So I'm going to start on the next page there where it notes in red, new adjustments identified since December 6th. Those are the ones that council hasn't seen. Unless there are any questions about the ones on December 6th. Actually, the one thing I will point out on those is the increased half-time eng assistant position to full-time, the 42,816, that's 3 lines down on the top of that slide. We're obviously not going to hire that person to start as of January 1st. The first realistic start date we anticipate is May 1st. So that budget has been reduced. As you'll see a couple of slides up, there's a negative that brings that down to $14,272 as an incremental expenditure in 2022. So on to the new items since January 2000 or December 6th, 2021. The first 2 there are just in and out. The fire department has been successful in obtaining a bunch of grant funding over the last number of years for some forest management projects to help protect against wildfire in Kimberley. So these are the projects that we've received grants for that didn't get completed by the end of 2021. As council is aware, it really depends on the weather from year to year. Hot, dry summers, they can't burn, they can't do that kind of work. So it gets carried over to the next year. So that's just the expenditures, the funding by grants. The next two came about as a result of the first time RCMP collective agreement being entered into in August of last year. And I'm going to stop at a slide. I've got a little ways down here to talk about the details, but associated with that, as we've been talking about for a couple of years, there was a one-time retro payment to the members for the Kimberley Detachment. They haven't provided the final number for that yet. There's a couple of letters attached at the end of this report. They're indicating that this is the top end of the estimate that they've provided for planning purposes. Is what they've said in the letter. So $227,000 is the estimate of what we're going to have to pay to the RCMP for retro pay. And anticipating that this was going to happen, council's put money in a reserve over the last number of years. And the balance of that, I think it's in the presentation. I think it's 441,000 or something like that. So there's a retro pay, and then there's also an RCMP contract cost increase. So on the recommendation of the RCMP, since 2016, which was the last time they had a pay adjustment, we've been adding 2.5% a year. So this addition of the 55,891 is the difference between that 2.5% a year and what we're actually having to pay them in 2022 under the new collective agreement. And what I'm proposing, and I'll talk more about this later as well, is that because we're going to have a fairly healthy balance, over $200,000 left in that reserve after the retro pay, I'm proposing, just given the challenges we're having this year with the tax increase, that we fund that out of the reserve as well, just for 2022, which would essentially defer a 0.5% tax increase from this year to next. And I think that's reasonable given the fact that reserve is specific to RCMP, and it was built through savings from that service over the last 5 years. So, and again, I'll talk about that more a little bit later. I'm not going to go through each of these in detail, but again, if you have any questions, most of the rest of these are fairly minor amounts. The larger ones, I do have slides later on just explaining, justifying the changes. But the total proposed adjustments, as you'll see there, are 394,893. And a few slides up here, you'll see that the expenditures that are funded from reserves bring that down to a fairly low number, which is the amount that's being funded from general revenues. Huh?
So just to clarify, the last line on this particular slide is what you were speaking about earlier with the later start for the engineer. Is that correct? Brings it down to the 14,000?
Yeah, that's right. The 28,544
Thank you.
subtracted from that the $42,000 there. Yeah. Yeah. So that's essentially bringing the budget for that from a full year down to 8 months, just given the fact that we're partway through the year here already. So again, the first few slides following this one, there's an explanation of the kameko gardens change there. That's an in and an out. But essentially what that is historically we had been paying KCES to manage the gardens. And with the announcement that they're winding down that society, we're gonna remove that payment from the budget, but then we're gonna add it back in under parks and facilities as an expenditure to hire somebody for the city to hire somebody to look after that. And the operations department is working on a staff report, as they indicated previously, to bring that back to council to have a larger discussion about the longer term with that facility.
Would that new parks, and we will probably have a better answer when the assessment comes out, but would this person be basically just bound to kameko Garden? Would they just be spread around everywhere? Could they be used anywhere, or was it just like a kameko Gardens caretaker?
I think the idea right now, and I shouldn't speak on Nicole's behalf here, but I believe we're anticipating that 76,000 will be to look after Kameko Gardens, at least until we get a feel for the operation of that. But longer term, that I think that would certainly be an option to have, you know, have an arborist or somebody on staff or a contractor to look after that.
Yeah, I think I saw somewhere in here where we're going out to RFP, looking for somebody to do that. So it would be an independent contractor.
That's right.
Yeah. Go ahead, Nigel.
I'm really disappointed that we're even talking about the options around Kameko Garden when we're yet to see a staff report. And I thought we were part of the decision-making process. I was even more disappointed to be reading about it in the media today without a staff report and now being able to weigh in as a council. So don't like the way it's playing out, quite frankly. I would have liked us to be discussing it before it hit the media.
Can you expand on that, Nigel?
Yeah, just the comments about RFPs and potentially people running it and stuff. I don't know any of those answers, but it's been discussed in the media. It's already hitting Facebook and the Bulletin's written an article about it. So yeah, I just think that was a little bit premature, or the staff report was late. I just think just don't enjoy the way this is playing out. I don't feel like as a council we really are a part of it. This seems to be happening behind the scenes. That's how it appears to me anyway.
Yeah,
Fair
point
comment.
taken. There was a previous staff report when there was discussions about KCDS winding down, indicating that this would be the path forward for this year anyways, until there was a bigger discussion on long-term. But,
Yeah, I thought so too, that early on, we said that the support that we had provided would be there this year because we weren't anticipating that staff report was going to be in time, you know, for that. So I think really the question that we got from the media is Kameko Gardens going to be open this year? And the answer was yes, it is. What the long-term solution is or the long-term future is for Kameko Gardens, given what's underway, we'll see. But, you know, for sure this year, you know, it will be open. I don't think there was any intent to, I thought we'd had that conversation actually around the table here much earlier on, back as part of the KCDS discussion. Kent.
Yeah, I see this as just maintaining the status quo for one more year, and the staff report will be talking about ways to change the status quo, maybe or maybe not. But I think that's going to be a conversation the communities going to want to be a part of, and so we're going to have to think about how we get feedback from the community as we move forward and look at different options. So
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
And that would be more my point, that it is starting to be played out in the media. There's a lot of misinformation happening on Facebook, a lot of concern that's been raised. I just would have liked to have had more information so I could respond to the community and some of those concerns. That's all I'm saying here. It's just, I would have liked to see a report. I would have liked more conversation before it hit the media. There's just too many unknowns out there at the moment.
Further comments? Go ahead, Jim.
Okay. Appreciate the comments, Councillor Keto. Chris Mummery is on the line here, and he's hearing that as well. So these next few slides here, I'm just going to flip through, and if you want to have some additional discussion on them, please let me know. You've seen these before at the December 6th meeting as well, the next few anyways. So the next one is the engineering assistant / GIS tech. So we're proposing to move that from a current half-time position into a full-time position that's shared between planning and operations. The slide following that is with regard to retirement sick leave payouts. And this is just, it's a liability that the city is obligated to pay until these grandfather benefits are gone, essentially. They're funded from the general operating surplus, just given their nature, so they don't have an impact on the tax collection or the tax rates from year to year. The next one is the Cayenne Commitment, and that's just the last year of the current 3-year commitment, moving the revenue and expenditures that are budgeted for 2022 into 2023. Their year overlaps. It runs from July to June or June to July. So it's really just a timing adjustment. The next one, 2022 election budget increase, $20,000 increase proposed there. related to potential impacts of COVID. That's proposed to be funded from the COVID-19 Safe Restart Grant Reserve. So if it's not used, it'll remain in that reserve to be used for something else. These next few slides here, parks irrigation maintenance, Parcel and parks tree maintenance. They're fairly straightforward, I believe. The next slide on the forest management program, zero net effect. I've already talked a little bit about that. The next one is the RCMP contract retro pay of $227,000 that we've talked about. So again, since 2016, the RCMP member salaries have been frozen, and on August 6, 2021, their first ever collective agreement was ratified. And I'm not entirely sure why it took so long for them to provide us with the information, but on February 28th, the mayor received an email with a letter attached advising of the estimated range of retroactive payments that you see there, $216,000 to $227,000. And as noted earlier, there's a balance of $441,000 in that RCMP contract reserve to pay that from. So there's fortunate planning there. The next slide is related. We've discussed this again. This is the RCMP contract cost adjustment. So the difference between what we budgeted and what the RCMP are saying in their March 4th letter to me, which is also attached to the report here, is $55,891. So that's the incremental revenue we need to pay for that incremental cost. Just something worth noting here, as you'll note in the letter there, they provide a cost for 8 members, $1.228 million. As council's aware, we on an annual basis make a request to the RCMP to manage that detachment to 7 members as opposed to 8. And they've been accommodating, I'm not sure when that started, but since I've been around anyways, we've been making that request. And it's possible, I suppose, at some point in time, they're going to say, no, we need the full contingent here. We need the full 8 members. And if and when that happens, at this point in time anyways, it's about $152,000 per member. So if they were to come back and ask for that, we would be looking for that money, which is, it's a percent and a half, roughly, tax increase.
Councillor Goodman.
So Jim, if we use the reserves to fund the 0.5% increase this year, will there be a double increase next year? A 0.5 and a 0.5, or?
No, I've noted on here, they're telling us that the 2023 to 2027 estimates, typically they provide us with a 5-year budget.
Yeah.
We're not going to receive that until May, so it won't be received in time to work that into the budget. But from 2022 forward, it'll be an incremental annual increase again. So I'm budgeting for 2.5% going forward.
Okay, but we budgeted for 2.5 for this year, and it was 0.5% too low, which makes me think.
Well, the 0.5% too low was to catch us up since 2016. So they hadn't received an increase since 2016. So that once we're caught up to 2022, and then we're just back into the regular inflationary adjustments going forward.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I hope. Anyways. The next slide, Cayenne.
So Jim, just further clarification on that. So this year, we're going to fund that 55,000 out of the RCMP reserve, but next year, we'll need to fund that out of taxes.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really just essentially a deferral of that 0.5% increase from this year to next year, in the hopes that we're not going to be facing the same challenges this year that we are. So the next slide.
You okay with that?
Yeah, happy to discuss it further if.
No, I just have a rather pessimistic outlook about each year going forward and whether we'll actually see anything relax, but we'll see.
Yeah, time will tell. So the next slide, the program Cayenne extension. Recently, at the February 14th council meeting, council extended that initial 3-year agreement with the Kimberley Youth Action Network by 1 year. So this is just creating a budget for that. It's $60,000 in revenue, 54,500 in expenditures, which are split 50-50 between this year and next, given the way that their fiscal year works. The $5,500 difference is an administrative cost that's retained by the city for the cost for our staff to look after that program, do the paperwork, etc. So the next table here is where we get into the numbers. So the first green line there, three lines down on the first top of that table, the 394,893 is what was brought forward from that previous slide. The total of the changes to the operating costs. The next section is the amount of those costs that are going to be covered from the various reserves. So they're not affecting the increase to the property tax rate. So the net of those two is $62,772, which is the net of the ask for this year, which works out to a 0.58% tax increase. On the next slide, we've got the 3.99% that we discussed earlier, which is already built into year 2 of the current 5-year financial plan. So we're adding the 0.58% for the 62,772. And then I'm also proposing to increase the inflationary factor that we had budgeted previously of 1.9% to 2.84%. So that's an additional 0.94%, bringing the total increase for 2022 to 5.51%.
Go ahead, Councillor McBain.
Appreciate you factoring that in, Jim. How confident are you that that is enough, given that, I think everybody's feeling the effects right now, and all signs kind of point to inflation going even higher. So just curious.
Yeah, it's a tough one to be confident about at this point in time, and municipalities seem to be all over the place. I was able to find 18 municipalities that I could find online that had either communicated or approved their tax increases. Of those 18, 10 of them were 5% or over. The highest was 8. The lowest was 2.75. That 8 was an outlier, as was a 2.75. So, I mean, most of what you hear about with inflation, the big components of those, the MPI, CPIs that are seeing a big hit these days are fuel and food. And so when you back that food component out, that the inflationary factor does drop. So I'm hopeful that this is going to be enough, I guess is what I'm saying. But it really, given we're still feeling the impacts of COVID with the supply chain challenges, the war in Ukraine, the CP strike. I mean, we don't know when it's going to end or how long these are going to continue for. But
Yeah, I feel you have your finger on the pulse, Jim. It was just a question. Thanks.
Good question, and I was expecting it because it's a tough one to put your thumb on this year.
So, pardon me if I may, Jim. I guess inflation to a lot of people is, costs are going up, but the term inflation is fuzzy. The fact is that if we have in the past years, if we had not taken the 2% inflationary increase, that cumulatively over the years would have meant that we would have had to take a reduction in service somewhere in the services that we provide. Inflation has to be paid for somehow. So it's either through taxes to keep service levels where they are, or we have to look at reducing the service levels. And it's a really, really difficult challenge because nobody wants to see service reductions. But at the end of the day, we either do that or you have to pay for them. And I think what we're seeing here in this particular budget is, a pretty good case scenario when we see what's going on around us. It's not a reduction in services, but it's also, a manageable increase that I think most people would understand. At least I hope they do. We'll find out.
I hope so as well, Mr. Mayor. And the real saving grace for us with regards to inflationary factor is the fact that we're still working under the wages that were negotiated in the last round of collective bargaining. So we work with a weighted average. when we're calculating that inflationary adjustment. So 2.84, it includes an increase of 2.18% for the wages, which is, I think it's around 50 or 60% as far as the weighted portion of that part of the index. So if our wages were tied to a CPI like a lot are these days, we'd be talking a different number right now, but that is helping us a lot. So the last section of that slide there's a small adjustment, $66,101 reduction, and that's a preliminary number related to non-market change. And I'll talk more about that in the coming slides here. So a reduction of 0.06 to 5.45%. So that's the proposed increase to the variable tax collection, or to the overall property tax collection for 2022. These next few slides here speak to this. Just some more discussion about the annual inflationary adjustment. So the MPI that we have been using since 2016, it's based on a weighted average of various expenditure categories within the city's budget using a bunch of Conference Board of Canada indices. And I've noted some of those below for what those indices are saying the increase was from fourth quarter of 2020 to the end of 2021. So 11.23 for vehicles and equipment, fuel and oil 65.46, materials, goods and services 11.23, natural gas 25.19. So if we were to use those indices, I mean, they don't seem to reflect what we've experienced over the last year. We've seen increases for sure, but if we were to use those indices, we'd be looking at tax increase of over 8% to calculate the annual inflationary factor. So what I've done is, in place of some of the indices or the amounts prescribed by some of the indices, is I've used the increase to the Canada CPI over the last year, which was 4.8%. I've used 20% for fuel and oil. And then for the wages, as discussed, it's at 2.18. So that's where that 2.84 got pushed out from. So we are varying from the typical MPI calculation this year. We do every year to a certain extent. I mean, if we've got negotiated wage increases, we'll use that as opposed to the indices. If we've got the rates from Terrace and Gas or BC Hydro, as far as what they're increasing by, we'll use those rather than the indice number. So I just wanted council to be aware of the fact that we've varied from that, and that's where how that 2.84 was arrived at. So it's not the 1.9 that we included in the budget last year. You know, we're increasing it by almost 1% to get that indice up a bit, but the goal was to implement a reasonable tax increase while still respecting the inflationary climate that we're in right now.
Sorry, Darryl, go ahead. Thanks, Jim. I appreciate the update. One of the things that, as you've been briefing us on this, that I've been wondering about is use of reserve money. If we are not successful in some of our grant applications for various things, one of them would be, for example, wastewater treatment plant, and the city decides to not pursue that avenue for the foreseeable future, or other avenues. Is there a chance, you know, given the climate of inflation, to use reserve funds as an emergency to help make this more palatable for folks in Kimberley?
The tax increase?
Yeah.
I always kind of compare that. That's kind of like using your kid's education fund to pay the mortgage payment. I mean, you're delaying the inevitable. Like sooner or later, I mean, you can use $100,000, say, to get the tax increase down to a lower amount, but then you're having to make that back in the next year. I mean, unless you keep taking that $100,000 out again and again and again to the point where, you know, you're getting close to depleting your reserves, then when your reserves are depleted, then you have to come up with that money. So that the ongoing annual expenditures, best practice is to fund that from ongoing annual revenues. as opposed to a pot of money in a reserve.
So in fact, Jim, we're suffering a little bit from that this year. The next slide, which shows the increases over the last 3 years, the 2.22, 0% in 2020 and 1.6 in 2021. Those last 2 years of no increases, we've lost 3% to inflation. And had we taken our normal 2% over those 2 years, we, instead of 5.5, we'd be looking at a 2.5% increase this year.
Yeah.
So to speak to your point, we did what we thought under the circumstances at the beginning of COVID was a good thing, but we have to eventually pay the piper for that. And this year is that year where we are doing that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Mr. Mayor. And on the next slide there, you'll see that, as noted, so the last 3 years, we've had an average increase of 1.27%, while the BC CPI over that same period has grown by 7%. So if we work that 5.45 into that as a fourth year, the 4-year average would be 2.31, which is, we're not far off from inflation there. So the let's see here. So the next slide here is options to reduce the tax increase, and I'm hoping, just given the discussion, that council is gained some comfort with that number. But if we want to reduce that, as the mayor spoke to a bit here, we could lower service levels elsewhere in the general operating budget. We could defer, reduce, or eliminate one or more of the proposed changes. In total, we're proposing, just over $60,000 in changes, so that would give us a little over 0.5%. We could increase general operating budget revenue other than tax revenue, user fees, permit and license fees, or we could reduce contributions to the general capital reserves, as we've talked about a little bit. One thing we have to remember, 2022, we collected about $14 million in revenue, and about 10.5, that almost $11 million was through property tax. The rest of that was through user fees, small community grant, business licenses, that type of thing. And we're not going to be getting that 5.45% on those. We've got 2% built in for the water and sewer user fees. There's also 2% built in there for recreation fee increases, but some of that stuff, small community grant as an example, there is no inflationary factor built into that. So
Yeah, it's just weighing in, just opining on on these options. Yeah, I would really hesitate reducing the contribution to our capital reserve. I just look at, we have done, I believe council over the last little while has done a lot to get caught up on infrastructure projects and various things. And we know we have some huge ticket items as well coming up. And I really, I don't want to slow that momentum down. And if we recall, I think, some of you who've been on council a lot longer than I have, a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with is because the can got kicked down the road for a long time. And we're trying to fix that. So I would really caution us trying to make a move like that, where we decrease those contributions, because I think we still have a long ways to go.
Councillor Oakley.
Yes, I do I would like to comment on the user fees. I have never, liked some of the recreational facilities that we have in our community not charging a higher level of user fees. I just personally feel user fees, there's room to move there to help out. And that's always a tough one, because people are paying out of pocket, and they're paying tax increases. It's just one thing after another. But it seems to me to be fair to some taxpayers in Kimberley that don't use the facilities, that don't have to pay the user fee, and that there would be a higher user fee for the folks that are using them. The other thing that I wanted to comment on was the regional district possibly, you know, having a little bit of a larger role in some of our facilities possibly as they do in other communities. So to help out and because people who come in from the region to use our facilities and are not paying a local municipal tax. So user fee to me is something I would love to look at that. I think that's fair and it's needed now. It's to look at that hard and to see if that can help out and make a difference. Thank you.
Thanks, Daryl. Councillor Dallin, go ahead.
I would caution against going too hard with the user fees simply because with the increased cost of living, particularly that increase to fuel, you know, that could disproportionately take the lower income folks and really price them out of those facilities. My main thing that I'd like to say is thank you, Jim, and the rest of staff that have helped you with this because, you know, you've carried the ball. You haven't, you know, in the last couple of years, we've borrowed from Peter to pay Paul, and we're obviously catching up with that today. But you've done an incredible job, you know, and thanks to you and all the staff.
Yeah, really appreciate that. I think we're all looking forward to getting back to a normal year next year when we're not having to do that. It's back and forth. Thank you.
Yeah, when you mention normal year, I think that's the other thing. I think we need to remember that there's a lot of cause and effect here as we're coming out of COVID that has been cumulative effects over the last 2 years. And it's unclear right now how that will sort itself out over the next 6 to 12 months. And so, you know, I would caution against us doing anything radical at this point until we really see, you know, kind of what direction that that ship is headed in. I would also like to make a comment about the user fees. You know, I think when it's funny when you mention user fees, Councillor Oakley, the first thing I thought of was sewer, water, solid waste. I didn't think about the recreational facilities right out of the gate. And so, you know, clearly there may be some opportunities to review where we sit in relation to other communities, for example, with respect to our recreational user fees. But I lay awake at night thinking about our sewer, water, and the major service user fees, because those are user fees that a very large portion of our community that's on fixed incomes don't have an option to manage. The variable tax rates they can manage because anybody over the age of 55 that owns a property can actually defer property taxes for a long time, basically until you sell your property. There's a way to get relief, but there is no way to get relief from the user fees. And so, you know, I think we need to be, you know, very cognizant of where those user fees go for that reason. Councillor Roberts.
I'd like to mention at this point that I really, really appreciate the measured response that Jim gives in terms of moving things forward in a way that is prudent and not in a frightening way and not in a way that is going to leave us hanging too badly. I came from an environment where I actually changed interest rates up 1 year, 21 times. And there was a point in time where I was mortgaging houses for 18%. So things can move crazy. Those are out of our hands. What we need to be able to do is the best for all. This is a huge basket of goodies that need to take place here. And I really appreciate the prudent way that you balance things so that we're not just insulting one portion of the budget for another portion, that we've got these things for our capital infrastructure fairly modest but prudent. And I just really appreciate the way that we've been handling this. And I would hate for us to digress too greatly in some fear that inflation is going to go nuts.
Thanks, Councillor Roberts. Councillor Dallin, further?
I just had one other thing, Jim. Do you have any idea what's coming down from the regional district, interior health, the school board, what those increases are kind of looking like? Because I know we've had some considerable percentile increases in those as well in the last couple of years, so.
Yeah, yeah, I think the regional district, their budget, they increased by 5% this year. That, I can't recall the number. It doesn't translate to a whole lot, as far as our taxpayers having to pay that. The hospital requisition, they've been stepping on that, hard over the last few years. I think this year is going to be another 45% increase. I think this will be the third. And that impacts, I think last year was about $30 that it added. So it's, again, not a huge amount, but we certainly wouldn't get away with an increase like that. It's totally different animal, but, and the school board, we won't hear from them until it's usually the first week of April where we get their requisition. So don't really have a feel for them yet at all.
So the hospital board, that's a good comment on that one, Jim. The hospital board is another example of not taking a prudent increase each year to build reserves. And in fact, they went for, don't quote me on this, I think it was more than a dozen years with no increases whatsoever. And then suddenly we're faced with a whole pile of capital improvements of which the hospital district has to pay 40%. And so it's catch up big time for not taking those increases in the small amounts when they should have been taken. It's a cautionary tale. The same thing happened to us with our water. Recall that we went about 8 years or 9 or 10 years or something like that without an increase to the water rates. And then all of a sudden we have nothing in the reserve and we're panicking to try and get the reserve back in place. So, you know, as much as we look at some of these small incremental improvements and say, well, maybe we can defer that. As you mentioned earlier, Jim, I guess I'm just reinforcing your comment that you pay the piper sooner or later. And if it's later, the price is higher than if it's sooner. Thanks for that.
Thanks for your comments, Council. So the next few slides here are on non-market change. We always just kind of, we always discuss non-market change, but we always just kind of gloss over it. So I just want to have a bit of a discussion. In addition to everything else we're dealing with this year, there was a bit of a hit to non-market change as well. Council will recall on December 6th, based on what BC Assessment calls the preview roll, there was a preliminary estimate of non-market change calculated of $207,513. We budget for $100,000 annually, so that seemed to indicate that we would have $107,000 that we could use to fund new expenditures, transfer to reserves, to reduce the tax increase. But the completed roll came out, which is an intermediary roll. We're still waiting on the revised assessment roll, which will come out in April. But based on the completed roll, that number has changed from 207,000 to 106,000, and that's not a final number yet either. So what's happened is, actually, I'll just go back to the previous page briefly. So most of the time, what we talk about when we're talking non-market change is new property tax on new assessment. So new assessment based on new builds, mostly residential houses that are being built. But non-market change can also result from boundary extension to bring in new assessment, property class changes, so changing from class 1 to 6, vice versa, exemption status changes, additions or deletions, so that's the new construction. Inventory change is the new construction, additions or deletions. I've got some examples of that on the next page, and then zoning changes. So onto the other page there. So as I've noted here, the most significant factor that contributed to the big reduction from that previous estimate to the current estimate is a $4.6 million reduction to the business class assessment as a result of non-market change. 3.7 million of that is related to deletions, which also ties into exemptions, as I'll discuss in a bit later here. And then 1.9 million due to property class changes, and then an increase of $931,000 due to exemption status change, which relates primarily to bootleg, previous being exempt, and we're working our way towards full taxation on that. So the deletions we're talking about relate almost entirely to Save on Foods. So what happened there is that property was eligible for the revitalization tax exemption that we offer, the Kimberley Investment Incentive Program. So because that was a multi-year build, in 2019, the old store, I think the assessed value was $2.25 million. Because they continued to use the new store while they're use the old store while they're constructing the new one, every year they would go look at that property at the end of October and assess what had been built there. And they would add that assessment of the new building onto the old building to the point where at the end of 2021, there was $5.5 million in assessment there. 2 and change related to the old building, the rest related to the new building. 2022 came along. They got final occupancy on the building, moved into it, demolished the old building. So they removed the folio associated with the old building, which was assessed at $5.5 million year prior. So that dropped off the assessment roll through non-market change. They added the cost of the new building, which is around $6 million. And then because they were eligible for that exemption, they reduced that by $3.8 million. So we saw a net reduction of about $3.25 million to Class 6 as a result of that building in particular. So that was a huge hit, probably $56,000 alone. So the residential non-market assessment in 2022, it increased by about $33 million, which would give us about $160,000 in new tax. So you deduct this $56,000 related primarily to Save on Foods. And then BC assessment, there was a number of properties up at the ski hills. So North Star, Mountain Village, and Mountain Spirit. A bunch of those properties, just because of the way they're zoned for use, they're a split classification. The portion for short-term rentals is Class 6, and when the property owners are using it, they allocate a portion of that to residential. So there were 17 units in there that they ended up moving from that split classification to 100% residential. So that was almost another, I think of the 1.9, it was about $1.2 million related to that. And as we know, the tax rate for Class 6 is about 2.5 times the residential. So you move from the higher classification into the lower, you're going to lose a bunch of tax revenue. So there's another $20,000 in change that was lost there. So that brings that $160,000 from residential. There was another $19,000, I think, related to recreation class to the good. So that gets us back down to almost the budget amount. So the complicated explanation, but I'm hoping that kind of explains to council what happened there. It's an anomaly that unfortunately happened in a year where we're facing a bunch of other challenges. So if that wouldn't have happened, we would have had a bunch of non-market change, which could have helped offset that tax increase. But
Councillor Kiddo.
So does that mean we got a bunch of extra money when Save On had 2 buildings down there?
we did get in 2022 when that assessment got up to 5.5, we received some additional non-market change there. Yeah. So that exemption it's a 3-year exemption. So 22, 3, 4, and then in 2025, we'll get that assessment or that money back again. So that brings us to the first.
So the 160,000 or so that we got from that it was a good thing we had a good year last year.
Yes.
Otherwise the pain would be a whole lot more.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a great year for residential construction. I mean, $33 million, that's a big number. So unless there's any questions on the previous slides here, I'll move on to the first slide where I'm asking council for some direction. That resolution being that council approved for inclusion in the 5-year financial plan bylaw, the proposed base budget adjustments related to the general operating budget as detailed in slides 16 through 31 of the CFO's March 21st, 22 presentation to council. And that'll allow us to proceed with bylaw. Thank you, council. Thanks for your patience through that. So the next section here is the Aquatic Center parcel tax. And as council's aware, through COVID, we've had some ups and downs, ebbs and flows with this as well. So just a bit of a recap on that. In 2019, we changed the Aquatic Center funding model so that the money collected through the parcel tax funds 100% of the operating deficit and debt payments associated with that facility. In 2020, at the onset of COVID, we had already adopted a bylaw setting that rate at $195.91. That was before we knew the extent of the extended facility shutdown. So we ended up collecting $361,000 more in revenue than we needed that year to fund the deficit and debt payments. So because parcel tax revenue can only be used to pay for what the parcel tax was established for, which was to fund the debt payments and operating the Aquatic Center, what we did is we put that into a reserve specific to that parcel tax. And what we talked about doing with that was using it in 2021 to reduce the parcel tax levy. So we were able to reduce the levy last year to $88.51 from that $195.81. And in 2021, the Aquatic Center actually ended up making more revenue than we had anticipated. So of that $361,000, we didn't need to use that all to make up for the deficit in 2021. So we were left with $63,000 in that reserve, which on the next slide, you'll see we used that we threw it against the 2022 parcel tax. So if you take the operating revenue, less expenditures, less debt payments, less the amount left in that reserve, we come up with a deficit, including debt of $946,000, and using a parcel count of 4,602, which could change, albeit slightly, with the revised roll when it comes out in April. That works out to a parcel tax of $205.67 per year. So we're really just getting back to that normal range. In 2019, it was $198.36. So now we're up to $205.67. And assuming we're not going to have, a big savings on the pool next year, I don't anticipate that we won't have a number like that to reduce the parcel tax by. So works out to about $13 that we saved on the parcel tax this year because we had that amount in reserve. We'll have to make that up next year.
So as the facility was shut down, I know we had a lot of feedback from taxpayers that are my taxes going to be reduced as a result of, the Aquatic Center not being used? The answer was yes. We gave that money back. But now that we're in full operation again, the $205 is what it costs to operate. So we gave the money back, and now we're back to where we were when we started. So it's not exactly an increase this year as it is a righting of the ship back to where it was pre-lockdown.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, thanks for those comments. So unless there's any questions on that, on the next slide is the next resolution I'm requesting from council, which is that council direct staff to prepare an amendment to the current Kimberley parcel tax bylaw to make the 2022 parcel tax $205.67.
Mover, please. Councillor Roberts, thank you. Councillor McBain seconds. Further discussion. I do have a question relating to the operating revenue and expenses. So at 340,000, that seems to be going up over the last couple of years. I seem to remember 300 kind of being the last conversation we had. So my question is, is the revenue going up lockstep with the expenditures? Like, are we continuing to kind of, keep that balance, or kind of what's happening with respect to expenses and revenues?
No, that'd be great if that would happen. I mean, the revenues are increasing by 2% a year based on the increases anticipated in the fees bylaw. The expenditures are increasing on average by that 2%, a little different this year, but so that 2% of revenue is a lot less than that 2% of expenditures. So that gap is going to continue to grow and grow and grow, and there's really nothing we can do about that. It's the subsidy or the deficit's going to continue to grow just because of the nature of the relationship there between revenues and expenditures.
So I don't expect you to have the exact number, but with respect to usage of the aquatic center, is that remaining flat? Are we seeing an increase in that, or because that's another way to increase,
Yeah.
to close the gap, obviously, is to get more usage out of the facility.
Yeah, I don't have that, Mr. Mayor. Council will have the discussion or the opportunity to ask those questions. The user fees bylaw for the rec facilities is going to be coming forward. I anticipate in the next month here. So I would think that there's going to be some discussion about that in the staff report, and an opportunity for council to ask some questions there.
All right, very good. Thanks, Jim.
Yep.
Councillor Dallin.
Just in relation to that, Mr. Mayor, contingent on the PHO order of necessary mandates, perhaps usage will go up when that relaxes some more.
Yeah, perhaps, although, yeah, I guess the question is, where was it pre-COVID? You know, versus, you know, kind of where are we coming out of it? The recreation facilities and the aquatic center in particular, you know, is one of those amenities in the community where you're never expected to make money. I mean, we're always going to be deficit financing. And, you know, I know we've been struggling the last couple of years with staying inside the operating budget. And we, in fact, have cut some hours and some corners at the aquatic center in order to stay inside that envelope. And I guess as we prepare for that conversation later on, you know, I think we need to be very cautious about cutting back services, you know, at the aquatic center. I think we need to look at ways of increasing revenues, I guess is what I'm saying. And hopefully that'll be an important part of the conversation when we see the staff report. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So unless there's any other discussion, the next slide is, have we taken a vote on that already? Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you. So the next section is proposed sewer operating base budget adjustments, and council has had these discussions already. On January 24th, I presented a staff report on financial analysis of the new wastewater treatment plant. So this is really just incorporating those changes into the budget with regards to the debt payments that we had budgeted previously, removing those from the budget, incorporating the debt payments that we discussed at that meeting into the budget, as well as the incremental operating expenditures associated with operating that new plant versus the old one when we flick the switch, hopefully in 2026. So I've just reiterated the resolutions that were passed at that January 24th meeting. I won't read through those. It does note at the bottom of this page, there was some discussion on January 24th at that meeting about as a way of deferring the principal payments on the debt associated with the new plant, undertaking interim or temporary borrowing for the first few years. So as we're going to spend $3 million in year one, 3 in year 2, and then have it operating in year 3, we temporary borrow, take out a short-term borrowing bylaw. That way we're only paying interest payments for those first 2 years, and then we enter have the debenture issue and enter into the long-term debt in the 3rd year. So the numbers that are on the table on the next page, that's what they reflect, is those estimated costs. As discussed at that meeting, we're basing the long-term borrowing on 30 years at 3%, which was that number was arrived at after discussions with the MFA. They made it very clear that that was an estimate. And as we know, we can't predict what the rates are going to be at that time, but. Councilor Roberts?
So Jim, the concept of temporary borrowing over the first couple of 3 years until it's complete, is that a traditional method?
Very common, yeah.
Thank you.
That's correct, yeah. This is all the last 3 years of the 5-year financial plan. And of course, all of that depends, it hinges on the grant application that we submitted for that facility. So March of 2023, I think, is when we're hoping to hear on that. So unless there's any questions with regards to this table, I'll move on to the next slide and ask that council approve the inclusion of these changes in the 5-year plan.
Sorry, didn't have my mic on. For those online, the motion was carried.
Okay, thank you, council. So the last section of the report here, we're done the operating side of things now. We're into the capital and non-capital project plan. Council initially approved the preliminary 5-year capital non-capital project plan on November 1st. There have been a number of changes since then. The reason we approve it that early is so that we can, any of the big projects that aren't already included in year 2 of the 5-year financial plan, we want approval of those, and then we actually make an amendment to the current 5-year financial plan year 2 to allow us to proceed with tenders and RFPs for those larger projects. Since that time, we've adopted a 5-year financial plan bylaw that impacted some of those numbers. Some of the projects that we had budgeted in 2021 are being carried forward for a variety of reasons. As one example, we ordered I think it was a tandem truck in January of 2021. We still haven't received it. I think we're anticipating receiving it this April. So there are a variety of reasons for these carry forwards, but they're all noted in the index individually. There's been some subsequent council resolutions passed that impact the plan, and there's a couple projects that have been added as well. So the next page here, and I'll go through these, the more significant ones anyways, on the next couple of pages here in these tables. And then as noted, they're all listed in the appendix. I do have some other slides after this that include a bit of a narrative on some of these. So the wastewater treatment plant, that's the first 4 items in this. Council's aware of those. That was again further to the discussion at January 24th. So just getting the updated numbers in there. The Kimberley gymnastics facility reconstruction, as everyone's aware, on December 14th, that facility was lost to fire. That facility is proposed to be rebuilt with a combination of insurance proceeds and some fundraising by the club. So that was added to the project at no cost to the city, but it is an asset that will be added to our balance sheet, so it's included in the budget. The Swan Ave Park reconstruction or construction of that new park, and I've got a bit of a blurb on that at a proposed cost of $222,000. Council passed a resolution at the February 28th regular meeting to increase the budget for the roofs at City Hall and RCMP based on bids that were received. And there's a couple of IT budget items there. Refresh of the Microsoft Office, we're taking that out, value of $45,000 because we're moving to subscription based. So we'll no longer need to do that. And so in its place, the manager of IT is introducing conferencing equipment refresh. So that's in 2026. So by that time, all the equipment has been added to this facility. We'll look at refreshing that. The Boundary Street reconstruction, that's the next 1, 2, 3, 4 items there. In November, when this was presented to council, it was the entire budget that was presented, including the city's portion and the third-party portions. So Tech is doing some work in that same trench, and it was proposed that the developer was going to do some work there as well. So because we won't be funding those projects, they won't be our assets at the end of the day. We're just removing those from the capital budget, and what's in Appendix A is the city's portion of that project. The Tech portion of that, we're not sure yet whether the developer portion is going to proceed, but Tech is committed to proceeding with their portion. They're going to advance us the estimated cost of doing that project plus a contingency. We're going to put that in the bank and use that money to pay the bills for their portion of the work as they come along. So there'll be no impact to the city's cash flow as a result of that. Next one down, Marysville Arena Building Condition Assessment. Council did receive a presentation about that. I believe it was the last council meeting. There were millions of dollars worth of recommended repairs, work that needed to be done to those facilities. And there was, I think it was $82,000 that was listed as immediate, so safety concerns. So the manager of Parks and Facilities has requested that those immediate expenditures of $37,300 for the Marysville rink and $44,700 for the Civic be included in the 2022 plan, so we can take care of those. Then there's a staff report forthcoming from the manager to discuss with council the rest of the recommendations in that report and get council's direction going forward on those. The rest of these relate to the financial plan amendment bylaw 2708 and the carry forwards. Again, they're detailed project by project in Appendix One. So if council wants to discuss those, please ask the questions. I'm not going to go forward through them at this point in time. There's a couple of non-capital items that were added to the list as well. Marysville Arena, removal of asbestos containing material. So that's, again, that's a health and safety item that we want to get done in that facility regardless of, what other repairs need to be done going forward over the longer term. And then the last one is asset retirement obligation implementation, which coincidentally kind of relates to the item above it. So in 2022, the Public Sector Accounting Board is introducing a new standard whereby public bodies, municipalities are obligated to recognize as a liability the cost of doing things like asbestos removal. So if this building, for example, we got an estimate saying that when this building comes down, we're going to have to spend $50,000 on asbestos removal remediation. We have to recognize that as a liability in 2022. The idea behind that, I think, being that they just want to force municipalities into planning for that, so that when, if and when we have to demolish these buildings, we're not having to scramble for the money to do it. The expenditure's already been recognized.
So, but that's a non-cash item.
That's
right?
a non-cash.
That's
It's a non-cash item,
the
yeah.
balance sheet entry.
Exactly. It's going to look really strange on the in the financials when it happens, but this is the reason for it.
Okay.
So we talked to an accounting firm in December and got a quote of $18,000 to help with the remediation or the implementation, and we're going to have to modify our financial statements and some of our systems to accommodate this. So I've got a budget of $20,000 in here, in just in case it went up a little bit. So those are both non-capital items. All of these are funded from reserves. So again, they don't impact the tax rates.
Councillor Roberts?
Jim, is that in addition to the previous general one about the general building condition for the arena of 37,300?
It is,
It's in
yeah.
addition to.
Yeah, that building condition assessment on Marysville had that as a 2022 item, but it didn't have it listed under the immediate.
Okay,
So it is in addition to that.
thank you.
Yeah. Good question. So these next slides, I think I've provided explanations already. So the wastewater treatment plant, gymnastics facility, Swan Ave Park. That Swan Ave Park, by the way, we first heard about that from some really keen citizens that live in the Swan Ave subdivision in January 13th of 2020, and they approached staff last year indicating that they had fundraised close to $120,000. They asked the city to make an application to CBT for $100,000 to complete the estimated cost, or to complete that project at the estimated cost of $222,000. So if that grant is approved, that will be the city's contribution to the project, and the rest will be funded through the grant or the fundraising efforts of those folks.
Councillor Goodwin?
The CBT website is showing a $99,000 grant to Kimberley for the Swan Avenue Park. So
Goodness.
we didn't get it all, but we got 99
We'll
out
take
of
it.
100.
That's great news.
So if I may, on using Swan Avenue Park as an example, so we have several of these community projects that come through. The expectation is the city takes over maintenance of these facilities. How do we account for that? with respect to service levels for parks and facilities.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think when the request came forward to apply for that CBT grant, I think there was an indication by the manager of parks and facilities in there that they were going to accommodate the increased maintenance of that facility within the existing workforce, which,
Okay.
you know, means stretching them further. Something else we should be thinking about, we should start doing, easier said than done, whenever we're adding a new asset like this, is the life of this equipment is going to be maybe 10 years. So we should almost be putting $25,000 a year away into a reserve to replace that when it gets time to replace. So that's kind of the, you know, the overall cost of these new assets.
Thank you.
The next one, City Hall RCMP roofs, we've discussed that. Boundary Street reconstruction, we've discussed that. The arena building condition assessment recommendations, and then the last one, the asset retirement obligation. And you will hear me talking more about that over the next year. And I suspect that BDO will potentially be mentioning it during their presentation of the financial statements for 2021, and certainly for 2022, they'll be speaking to that as well. So the last bit of direction I'm seeking from council is to improve the inclusion of these changes in the 5-year financial plan going forward, and to approve the capital and non-capital projects in Appendix 1 for inclusion in the plan. Okay, I guess that wasn't the last bit of direction. Sorry, I faked you out there. The next slide is proposed next steps. So based on the direction the council has provided here, there is one more piece of direction here, but I'm proposing that at the April 25th regular meeting, the 5-year financial plan bylaw, tax rates bylaw, and aquatic center parcel tax bylaw be brought forward for consideration of first three readings, brought back for adoption on May 9th, and then processing of and mailing of the tax notices over the next couple of weeks. So the next and last direction I'm seeking from council is to send staff away to draft the 5-year financial plan bylaw and the tax rates bylaw. Thank you, council. I don't know about that. Appreciate your, again, your patience through that.
I think it's important for us to remember that roughly when you consider the size of the budget, have actually done a very thoughtful and I'm searching for the right word here. It's a respectful budget under the circumstances, the very difficult circumstances that we're operating in these days. And we're doing this without sacrificing any city services. And in fact, as we move into next year, we're looking at the possibility of increasing service. So sorry about that. So, you know, thanks so much, Jim and staff, Scott and staff for, you know, all the great work on, you know, getting us to where we need to be for 2022. Councillor McBain.
Yeah, I think the word I would use to describe, and I think I've used it before, Jim, for your presentations, is digestible. It's makes our job a lot easier. The explanations that you provide, I know it helps me a lot, and I really appreciate it. And I hope, you know, when folks listen in, they get the same sense of what we come to appreciate from you. So yeah, it's great.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the comments. It lets me know that I'm kind of on the right track with this stuff. It is my whole goal putting this together is really to make it understandable and digestible. So that's, if I've done that, that's great to hear. Thanks.
Scott, do you wish to weigh in with any comments?
I'll just keep it short. Jim, thanks again. Great job.
Thanks.
You know, crisis management is one thing, but we seem to be stacking crises lately. So, you know, whether it's inflation or oil prices and gas prices going through the roof, war in Europe or a pandemic, Jim's kept a steady hand on the wheel and has guided us through. So tough budget. I really appreciate Jim and the rest of staff's hard work. And thank you to council for having trust in us all.
Thank you, Scott. Anything further, council? All right, we have some correspondence that we need to receive this evening. 2 letters, as a matter of fact. Could I have a motion to receive? Councillor Goodwin, thank you, and Councillor Kiddo seconds. Any comments? Hearing none, call the question on receipt. All those in favor? The motion is passed. And I think unless council has any further comments, or Jim, last call.
No, just again, thanks to council. Thanks to staff as well. There's a lot of time and effort put into coming up with this stuff from all of the managers. So
Yeah, no doubt.
yeah, so I thank them.
You don't make this stuff up.
Oh.
Okay, awesome. Move adjournment. Councillor Dallin moves. Councillor Goodwin seconds. All those in favor? Motion is carried. Thanks, folks. We're done.
I'm glad you remember that.